Thank you very much. In SOPAC in Brisbane, I noticed that relatively early in my presentation there was quite a range of people that disappeared. I hope that doesn't happen here because there's nowhere else to go, I know. There were alternatives in Brisbane. I think it was because the title doesn't really convey what the subject really is all about. The integrated part of assurance is not just how you integrate different streams of risk and assurance and activity inside the organisation. The integration here referred to is actually related to a process that's globally referred to as integrated reporting. And so it's the trend from, firstly, I'll illustrate in a few moments, the move to sustainability reporting that's occurred really since the late 1980s through to now, and the separation of the annual report from the sustainability report. And the next move in that trajectory is to move towards integrated reporting, aggregating all of the impact of the organisation into a single report. So I'll explain at the start a little bit of that trajectory, and it's in the context of moving towards more integrated reporting. What's the challenge for internal audit to create integrated assurance? And so that's the subject matter here. So I'll pause for a moment to see whether anybody needs to check their phones, or just so that you've got your chance. Here's your chance. Okay, so the other thing is that I'm a member of the Institute of Internal Auditors, but I'm certainly not a professional internal auditor. I trained originally in engineering and did some management training, and have worked most of my life in the health, safety, environment part of large global corporations, and got into the assurance side of things in BP after the Texas City incident, and there was a move to give far greater assurance to the board of BP about the way that operational activities were being managed within BP after that terrible experience. And then moved into BHP and continued on doing much the same thing within the health, safety, environment function until about 5 years ago we moved out of the HSE function into internal audit. And it was a bit like the road to Damascus. The scales fell off my eyes. I found out what internal auditors are really all about. And I'm rather embarrassed now about the joke that I used to tell, which was the people who choose internal audit are people who haven't got enough personality to be accountants. And I sincerely apologise for that, because now that I'm in it and I understand what it's all about, it's a whole different world. And that epiphany is having quite some significant impact within my organisation, and I'll try to explain a little bit about how that's happening, that what you can come to find when you come to internal audit and realise the professionalism of what internal auditing is really all about. And so I now take my hat off to you. It's significantly changed the way that I understand what I used to think I knew all about and now realise I knew so little about. And I'm busy trying to educate people within our organisation just along that same trajectory, and hopefully they'll come through it quicker than I have. So I'm going to be talking about sustainability reporting, as I indicated, integrated reporting, sustainability data, financial data versus sustainability data, and then the assurance dimensions of this: operational assurance, sustainability assurance, assurance as a process or a report, and again, harking back to the introduction, and where to from here. I noticed from the attendance list that not many of you come from global mining companies. And so, again, please keep awake, because some of the stuff that was being talked about before lunch is really related to the extent of the activity of internal audit beyond the traditional comfort area of internal auditors. And that's really what this is talking about. It's a very specific area, or operational assurance, but it has, I think, relevance in lots of other areas. And a large part of what we do in BHP Billiton is that we use a large part of this assurance is actually delivered by what we affectionately call guest auditors. And these are people who are not professional auditors that come and join audits, undertake the field work. And some of what I'll be talking about is some of the challenges of managing those in the IPPF framework and getting the standard that we expect from internal audit delivered by people who are not professional internal auditors. And the education that is associated with that and the development that those individuals go through when they have that experience, and the greater sense of I guess the much more confidence they have about what happens when they're being audited when they go back to their normal operations. So I mentioned the start of sustainability reporting, and it goes back to chemical industry in Europe, challenges the environmental impact of the chemical industry in Europe, and the challenges of companies to try to represent how well they were really treating the environment when most of the activists were campaigning to show how poorly companies typically were treating the environment. And it spread from that through the World Commission on Environment and Development, which was a United Nations study, and it led to this report, which was called Our Common Future, and that was the book that actually created the first term, or first use of the term, sustainable development. It was looking to how could the development of the world, which was seen in the 80s to be a trajectory towards complete consumption of the total resources of the world and ending up in very few generations with nothing left, how can we move to a concept that says we are in a limited environment, there is only one Earth, how can we move to sustainable development, the economic development that's expected, but do it sustainably. The term that was coined from that by a communications specialist actually was the triple bottom line, referring to environment, social and financial outcomes. And the Global Reporting Initiative, which was mentioned in the introduction, was an approach largely by NGOs to get together and hold corporations accountable for what they were doing. It was based on the premise that what gets measured gets managed, and they constructed a framework of measurement and reporting which created a whole lot of measurement areas in the area of environment and social impact as well as financial impact, and created standards that then progressive global organisations volunteered to comply with. And in fact, I've been in organisations that have complied and in fact still claim to comply and do. We get assured, there's external assurance to guarantee that compliance occurs. But it's interesting in watching that trajectory over that 30 years or so, the maxim of what gets measured gets managed is actually not quite true, because you can actually measure a whole lot of stuff that you don't manage. And it's not just a matter of getting out there and measuring, there's a whole lot more to it. And as I said, the trajectory from there, from developing the separate sustainability report, which in some companies are challenged as being just a PR document, whereas many boards invest a lot of substance in those reports. And one of the challenges is can you believe what is actually written in those reports? And part of that move is towards assurance of those reports. And in the organisations that I've been in, the choice has been to use the external auditors that audit the financial accounts to also audit the sustainability report. And the question is, what is it they're actually auditing, and what's the discipline in the process behind the creation of that information that actually gives some confidence that the information that's being published is correct. And what you find very early in the piece is something that I'll come to in a moment, is that the challenge that's been involved in financial reporting for decades, many, many decades, that you need to report correct numbers, doesn't always exist within the health, safety, environment area. That you can, the trouble with integers is that you can work arithmetic even if the basis of the integer is completely wrong. And so 2 plus 2 can equal 4, but if 2 should have been 3 and the other 2 should have been 5, then the 4 doesn't mean anything, but it looks like it means something. And that's the challenge in assurance, that in the early days we would have external auditors come in and they would look at the corporate activity to aggregate the sustainability report, and all they would look at was the head office processes. And so they would say if the numbers came in from the far-flung operations around the world and were added up correctly, then therefore you can believe the report, or multiplied correctly, or divided, or whatever else you did to manipulate the numbers to produce a graph or a piece of information. And it really misses the point. When you start getting out into the operations and you find that the numbers are produced by people who with all due respect, don't know and don't care and are never being checked to see if it's right or wrong, then is it any wonder that you can actually get significant misinformation promulgated? And external auditors can't always find that. You really need to move into quite disciplined internal auditing before you actually find some of the very significant errors, and I'll mention in a moment. So just a little bit more introduction on integrated reporting. There's a website, integratedreporting.org, which if you're interested in this, then I would advise you to go and have a look at that. It's really a whole lot of people that want to tell companies what to do getting together, and most of the people who earn money off telling companies what to do or giving advice are involved in this. Their professional associations are in there, and all the big four are in there, and they all see this as a huge, great income possibility into the future. They're creating more rules and expecting that organisations are going to comply with them, but it's really down into the third dot point there and the summary dot points that it's a sense of a different model of how corporations interact with the world. It's a model that says we're not just a matter of manipulation of financial capital. There's actually, they describe and define in here that list there of 5 other capitals that if you look at transactions and activity that's occurring in your organisation have influence on the sum total of either wealth creation across those capitals or diminution. You will have heard, I'm sure, already of natural capital, referencing the services the environment provides to companies, but there's a whole lot of others there that are described. And so this is really in its infancy. The ideas about how you would actually aggregate this, how you would measure it, how you report it is very early stages, and certainly very rarely found in Australia. This is something that is moving very quickly in Europe, to a lesser extent in the United States, and really in its infancy here. So we're looking quite a long way over the horizon in IIA in inviting me to speak about this subject. So I won't spend too much time over the horizon. I'll come back to now how you might get to a point where you're getting ready. And if you're in the sustainability reporting world, then let's work out what implications are for assurance in that world. KPMG do surveys. That's what companies like that do, and they go around and ask people, and then they tell you what you told them. And this is what they're telling us, or what we've been telling them, that some people are moving in this direction, quite focused towards the largest companies in the world. Only 1 in 10 state that they produce integrated reports, and that's a voluntary notification. It's whether they're doing it or not may be tested further. A lot of them go for independent assurance, and you know, part of KPMG's interest in this is to show how many others are doing it, and so why aren't you doing it too? And go out and get your KPMGs or E&Ys and the rest of them to come and do your assurance for you. And the Global Reporting Initiative, which I was mentioning earlier, which is really just focused on sustainability reporting, not full integrated reporting, is by far the most popular of the voluntary reporting guidelines that are used around the world. And that's a picture of our latest one. The sort of data that goes into these reports is completely varied. There are no obligations. The GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, is an attempt to try to hold people accountable to a certain structure, and they have a accreditation process that you sign off and say, yeah, you're complying with the guidelines that they've produced, and you can get that external assurance to prove that. Part of it is very familiar to people in the risk world of identifying what are the material issues that you think ought to be discussed in the reports, and this is the illustration that's used in the BHP Bulletin report that shows our assessment of the material sustainability issues, and it's not the only way, it's not the right way, and it does change from year to year, but this is the sort of the basis. Now, the reason for showing this is to say that the next part of the report is not just to say these are the issues, but this is how we're going on those issues. And so how is it that we can measure performance? How can we set targets? How can we track progress towards these things? And this is where it's in that part of the disclosure where assurance starts to come in to say, this is what we say, how do we know that it's right? Now, as I illustrated, the sort of bread and butter of more traditional auditing is in the financial world, and much of the stuff on the left-hand side of that screen you will well know. The standards are clear, the expectations are clear, the interpretations are many and varied. Interestingly, in my studies, when I first started accounting, I thought that was very strict and clear, and you just work out what the rule was and apply it. There's an immense amount of creativity in accounting. The first question is, what level of profit do you want to show? And then we'll work backwards through the accounts so that we get to that point. But there are rules and there are expectations and there are things that you can test against. In the sustainability space, as I said, it's relatively new. There are few universal definitions. Many companies define things in their own way. There are inconsistent assurance standards. So what do we do when we go in and what do we check against? There is little legislated oversight and few professional agreed standards across this as well. One of the areas that has grown to significant prominence of recent times, like in the last 8 to 10 years in Australia, is greenhouse gas accounting. And some of the challenges about monetising emissions of greenhouse gases means that it's not just a matter of counting how many tonnes go out the chimney or however else you emit your greenhouse gases, but what are the dollars that are likely to be associated with that emission. And then it becomes a whole lot more serious about exactly how much is going out, because most chimneys, most tailpipes, you actually can't measure how much carbon dioxide is going out there. You have to go back to a second order of assessing how much carbon in the fuel went in the first place and assume that all of that carbon gets, through the combustion process, gets changed from carbon atoms into carbon dioxide atoms. Now, firstly, the combustion process isn't perfect. Not every carbon atom turns into a carbon dioxide atom. And secondly, there's all sorts of other losses that occur along the way. And so if you're going to monetise every carbon dioxide atom that comes out of a chimney, you want to have a pretty fair idea of you're getting largely the right number that's going out. And it gets even more complicated because there are carbon dioxide emissions associated with energy that you consume. And so the fuel that you use in your vehicles, or more importantly, the electricity that you consume in your organisation, has been the product of probably some other combustion process, which may have been coal or gas, or perhaps it was notionally delivered by some sort of sustainable method, wind or solar or hydro. How do you know where your electrons came from and how much carbon is attached to every one of those electrons that came through? How do you know how you're measuring the electrons that come through into your organisation? You say, well, we pay for them, and so of course we know exactly how much electricity is coming in. And so you go to somebody who's involved with electricity meters and you say to them, well, when was the last time you calibrated the meter that showed how much electricity we used? And they said, calibrate? It's reading, it's showing me a number. Of course it's correct. Well, if you put a certain amount through and you determine whether it's right, then that's a pretty basic part of whether you're paying the right amount of money. And often that question is just never asked. We just pay what it says on the meter. And then beyond that is when was the meter last maintained? So how do you know that even if it was calibrated at a certain point in time, how long has it since been maintained to make sure that it's still operating consistently whenever the calibration was done? Now, that sort of stuff doesn't matter supposedly it does matter when you're paying for electricity. It doesn't matter too much if you're just reporting how much carbon dioxide you're emitting from the organisation. But if you're trying to hold your hand on your heart, or your board is saying you can believe what it is that we're reporting, then you need to check all that sort of stuff through. And that's the sort of stuff that is very basic if you take an internal audit approach, which says, tell me what the process is, tell me where the risks may be in that process, and what are the controls that you've got in place to make sure those risks don't eventuate. Then it's pretty simple that it all drops out. But we just don't apply that. And again, it's back to this question that integers can work by arithmetic, that you can work out how much you have to pay because the meter says that's how much you've used. But how do you know the meter is correct? Skepticism that we have in assurance is not something that always applies everywhere else because everybody's really busy. So from there, what does assurance mean? We've got all these problems that I'm starting to talk about, and what are we doing in what I've sort of loosely referred to as internal audit out of the office. It's getting out around and seeing what's happening in the organisation and which parts of this information that the organisation is saying is correct do we need to find a way of checking to see whether it's correct. The history of HSE type auditing and much operational auditing is very much in the compliance space rather than the risk-based space. And so that's a transition that's been gone through a long time ago in internal audit. I'm well aware of that. Outside internal audit, it's very much easier to find out what the rules are and seeing whether you're complying with the rules rather than determining what are the risks are in the process and what are the controls that need to be in place to make sure the risks don't eventuate. And the rules that are in place are largely a form of controls, that's clear, we all know that, but the people justifying those procedures and justifying those rules for which you can get assurance against them, they tend not to have done that first principle assessment of why are these rules the right rules? What are the risks that we're actually trying to control with these particular rules? And those sorts of questions can get very complicated, particularly with people who work in a functional space for a long period of time. When you spend your whole life in HR or you spend your whole life in HSE, you don't think much more about risks that you're trying to manage. It's all about the controls that you've got in place, the things that you're doing to stop the bad things happening without really articulating specifically what the bad things are. And without that discipline of going back to that first order risk assessment and determining why the rules are the rules, then you can have the wrong rules in place for a long period of time. Because the other problem with risk management is that having the wrong controls doesn't guarantee that the risk is going to eventuate. You can still play the probabilities for a long period of time. And so you can have the wrong things in place for a long period of time if you haven't got the discipline that is embedded in this profession around determining why. Professional and guest auditors, the balance here is the question of anybody can ask a question. Again, the problem you have with arithmetic you can also have with English, that you can read questions, but you're going to understand what the answer is. And this is where you have to have a balance between people who know what they're talking about and people who know how to ask questions and know how to ask the right questions. And the challenge is to get that balance correct. We use a significant number of guest auditors, as I mentioned, and they know what they're talking about. Let loose, they will look at what they want to look at, not what should be looked at. They will ask the questions they want to ask, not the questions that should be asked. And so the way that we typically try to illustrate this is to say what we're trying to do here is objective auditing with subjective people. So people are limited by their own knowledge, their own, what they refer to as common sense. Common sense is just your own body of knowledge. And so I've seen in previous experiences where people are new to this process, they go to audit after audit after audit if they're employed as auditors in the operational space, and audit after audit after audit, they find the same finding after audit after audit after audit. And that's because that's the question that they're asking every time, because they've got some confidence that they're going to find something, and so that's what you need to do in auditing, isn't it? It's find findings. And so if you've got a higher degree of probability with this question of finding a finding, then if you're not a professional auditor, then you'll go back to that question time and time and time again. The other thing that happens with guest auditors is that if they are functional specialists or operational specialists of some type and they're talking to people who are in that same professional role, maintenance people talking to maintenance people, engineers talking to engineers, then they can have a fantastic 2 or 3 hour meeting talking about all sorts of things, but nothing about the questions that you wanted them to ask. And they come out of the meeting and they say, that was a great meeting, I learned a lot, I really learned what they're doing here. And you say, but what about this bit and this bit and this bit? Well, no, we didn't quite get to that, but boy, I learned a lot about what they're doing here. And the other challenge is that the standards that they set are the standards that they've got from their own operation, and this place isn't doing it the way we do it back home, and so this place is wrong. And of course, that's not right either. And so these are lessons that we've learned in trying to manage these people, that you have to have much more discipline around them understanding what it is that they're doing. There's an immense amount of value in the interaction that I'm describing. it is extraordinarily valuable for the company to have people in that formal setting where they're asking formalised questions about issues which they are particularly interested in, and they will be learning from the answers and they will take those answers home again. But they need to have those conversations after they've done the auditing bit. And that's the discipline. How do you get them to do the auditing bit first and the conversation second? Sampling is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in the operational space because there is so much operational activity that occurs that actually doesn't create a record of what it was that occurred. And so in the more traditional audit area, largely the work involves records. The activity, the record is generated automatically. There's a record that's there and you can apply your sampling processes and you can test and do it as you all know how to do. When you haven't got those records, what do? How do you get confidence that you have actually got a reasonable sample of what it is that happens in that operation, which in our case is typically over a 2-year period in between our operational audits? How do you know that you've done enough checking? Have you looked at the records? Have the records been created contemporaneously with the event occurring? How do the records occur? So sampling is a huge issue, and the statistical tables of, this happens once a year and so you do it this many tests, or this happens once a week and you do it this many tests. It's really, really hard to work out ways that you can give confidence back to the rest of the professional auditors in the group that you work with, and then superiors above that you've actually done adequate testing and you're not relying purely on the opinion. It's part of quality, I understand that, and when you come from the operational space, the operational experience of auditing is that if the auditee agrees with the finding, then your quality control is done. And that's largely because auditees will typically fight and scratch and cut until they can't find any other resistance to say, okay, it's a finding, I agree. They really don't like them. They think it's a performance measure. They think they're going to be held accountable for why they didn't do it right. The quality question of whether because they agree, therefore it's okay, is clearly not adequate in our professional standards. And so taking people beyond that to say, well, they said it was a finding, so it must be a finding, is a real challenge. Documents, observations, inquiry, we've spoken about those. Work papers are notoriously difficult to get people to record what it was that they did. The discipline that we all learned, I didn't learn it when I was young, but as you come through the audit profession, you understand why it is you have to keep records. For people who have found a finding, then all the things that they didn't inquire about, all the things that were okay, are very minor records of what it was that was occurring. So that discipline that we expect is something that you have to manage very, very carefully too. And re-performance is a foreign concept. Honestly, they don't understand what that is all about. And so it takes a while to get them to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. Process or report, this is really just referring back to the external assurance that occurs around sustainability reports. The experience that I have had with the external audit providers is that they are looking at whether the reader can be confident that the content of the report is reflective of the actual situation in the organisation. And that's entirely different to whether the process is good enough to manage the risks that the organisation faces. And that assurance of the process is what the internal assurance can give when the external auditors are just focusing on whether you can believe what's in the report. And again, that distinction of the relationship between the two is critically important when you're establishing a process that might be aligned into the external auditing. We're at a point where just this year we've got to a point where our external auditors are prepared to rely to a very, very minor extent on the work that my operational assurance team is doing. And that's part of an illustration that we've been working in this direction towards full compliance with IPPF for 4 years now. And every year there's been external assurance of our sustainability reports. We've just got to the point where they're prepared to say, yeah, it looks like you're getting a little bit close. And so that's potentially significant value for the organisation. We will push that as hard as we possibly can, but it takes a long, long time to get to that understanding if you have achieved the professional standards that are required. So I've mentioned when you've got over all those issues around what the auditor does, what are you actually looking at? Because the next challenge is that the management of this data, if it is data you're looking at, or the process, if that's what you're looking at, is notoriously poor. In the early days, we would go and do greenhouse gas audits, and we would ask for the records, and they'd bring out a spreadsheet that showed all of the assumptions and all the calculations and all the stuff that I was telling you about how you work out how much greenhouse gas comes out of a particular area. And you'd say, so how was that put together? And they say, oh, well, we got the vacation student, the environmental engineer, to do that. They were here at Christmas, but no, we haven't seen them since. But they left this spreadsheet, and that's what we reported. And you say, whoa. Taking them through an understanding of why it's important to manage the data that they're reporting. So often, as most of you already know, the precursor of most fraud is some sort of mistake that didn't get found out. And the person who perpetrated the mistake recognised it's a mistake, found that it was to their personal advantage, tested it one more time to see that it actually still doesn't get found out, and then suddenly you've got a mechanism going that you've got confidence you're not going to be found out. Much the same in this space. If nobody checks to see whether the data is correct, then you can continue reporting incorrect data forever. And it goes all the way through to some parts of this stuff is used in remuneration calculations. You already know, I expect many of your organisations, if you're in the operational space, will be using safety data as part of remuneration of very senior managers in the organisation. But the capacity for fraud in safety data is extraordinary. The interpretation of the determination of whether an incident is a lost time injury or whether it's a medical treatment injury or whether it's a first aid injury is highly subjective. The rules are very clear, but the interpretation of those rules and how it was applied in that particular circumstance, which ultimately will lead to remuneration of the chief executive, it's amazing how little attention we pay to that collectively. And that's just the numerator. The denominator of how many hours were worked in the organisation, boy, you try and work out that and what records were used and what basis that record was understood. Do they take any account of annual leave in determining the number of hours worked? Do they take any account of overtime? How do you measure contractors if you've got them in part of your calculations? So every step of the way, if you start opening this can of worms and start looking at it, there's significant challenge. I won't go through all of that list. So really, where to from here? This is a fertile ground for the professionalism of internal audit. There is immense value to be created in the organisation, both from getting the information correct, getting confidence that the risks that the organisation face are being managed, and if you choose to go down the guest auditing line, firstly getting an immense amount of credibility into the assurance that you're providing if you can control them adequately to deliver those expectations that we have with the International Professional Practices Framework. We've got to a position where we have asset presidents recommending new appointments into general manager positions round out their development by getting involved in the internal auditing activity. And so we have general managers who come and become guest auditors for us. The discipline that they learn about how you walk around an operation and actually look at what's happening, because that's what you have to do when you're doing an audit, is immensely valuable. The distraction that you have when you walk through an operation, if you've got a particular issue that you need to be addressed, or if you're a senior manager and you just have to get something done, that discipline of understanding how you can actually look left and right and understand what's going on, or ask questions that will lead you to get a better understanding, is significantly valuable. And the opportunity to go to another operation inside your organisation for, typically we have them for a couple of weeks at a time, that opportunity to get really in-depth analysis of what's happening in that other operation is so much different from the 2-hour tour when you're looking at the bus window, the industrial tourism that often happens. And that is another immense value that is being recognised in our organisation. It hasn't always been like that, but to get to the point where people are recognising that they understand a whole lot more about what they have to do to deliver information to people who are auditing, and also understand more about other operations is an immense benefit that we achieve. So operational audit, I think, is critical no matter what your operations are, and finding a way to do that best suits your requirements with the balance of professional and potentially guest auditors, internal or external. We have areas where we don't have adequate independent understanding of particular specific risks in our organisation, and so we get contractors in, and again, contracting consultants are no good as auditors. A contracting consultant is typically having a look at something to find out how he can justify getting some more work out of you. That's not what you want from an auditor. You want them to be disciplined about how they check and review. And so they're very, very useful, led an immense credibility to what it is that you're doing, but you really do have to manage them even more so perhaps than your internal people. IPPF is absolute, the top. We have to deliver that. And in the early stages when I moved out of HSE assurance into our internal audit group, I didn't even know the acronym, and it's such a credible framework interpreted for when you're applying it to this different type of auditing. I've mentioned about data management. You can't go in and expect that you're going to audit something into existence. You have to get into the discipline of recognising why the information that you're assessing in this operational space is important, and then generating the management control that ultimately will lead to something that gives relatively clean assurance reports. And it isn't just introduced by auditors saying this is what you have to do. You need a process in the whole organisation. And performance assessment is something that's a real challenge, that when people believe that their performance is determined by the number of findings that they get in an audit, is really a sign of very poor, more senior management. And we've gone through the process. I think we've almost eradicated it, where people actually wrote KPIs about how many audit findings they were going to get. And of course, the fight that you have with somebody who's trying to protect their bonus when you're in an audit is just ridiculous. And so this understanding that assurance is, we characterise it as being a in-depth incident investigation before you've had the incident. So you didn't know something was wrong, but we've given you the attention and that you would normally have after something's gone wrong to enable you to fix it up before it's gone wrong. And that's not a matter of whether you've performed well or whether you haven't. It is important to acknowledge that there are times when people are accountable for things that are found in audits, but that ought to be the basis of a quite significant incident investigation. You know, treat an audit finding like an incident and then work out how come it got to that point, and then determine whether any sanction is appropriate, not just the fact that there's been a finding. So I really think it's lazy management for using assurance like that, and it really doesn't help us at all in what we're doing. So we've taken it all the way up to the executive leadership team and said this is, you know, it just doesn't work. It can't work in the organisation. We understand the principle. We understand that you don't want to have audit findings, but measuring it and putting KPIs on it isn't the way to achieve that outcome. So there's more to come. This is early days. We've had an interesting experience over the last 5 years. The direction that's not on this slide, but the next one after this, is moving back to perhaps where I was before, where we move more into the 3 lines of defence, where the HSE function takes over more of this stuff, and the assurance group looks more at the process that the function and the line are doing to manage these risks. We've proven a way that you can do it. We're now working with the health, safety, environment function to build an assurance program that the internal auditors would be able to rely upon. When I was doing it in HSE, when I first came into the organisation, there's no way that internal audit could have relied on what I was doing, given what I know now. But now I can help the function where I came from build a program that will be credible, that will actually reduce the amount of in-depth assurance that we do in our internal audit group. And so applying the 3 lines is probably not here, but next one for us. Thank you.